Committee will come to order. Welcome to today's hearing on this very important topic of whether youth in foster care are being prescribed medications, whether or not they're being prescribed appropriately. We'll hear from our witnesses that too often the answer is no. We know from research that foster children are prescribed mind-altering psychotropic drugs at very high rates, for higher than other children. CRS found that between 2008 and 2010, nearly one out of every 4 children in foster care was over-medicated. That's more than 4 times the rate among children overall. In too many cases, government programs may be trying to medicate away the troubles these youths have experienced that will remain with them for many years after the medications end. Donna Hovenier is a young woman who was recently in foster care in my home state of Washington. She was unnecessarily medicated with a number of mind-altering drugs, and will explain how that helps no one, least of all the youth who need it the most. And Dr. Phil McGraw will second this assertion that one of the most critical reasons to address the problem of over-medication is to ensure children receive proper treatment and not just chemical straitjackets that keep them from acting out. Congress has taken a number of steps in recent years to highlight this issue, and we expect states to continue focusing more attention on prevention as a result of these changes. Federal law passed in 2006, 2008, and 2011 sharpened the focus of states on medical needs of foster youth, including the need to develop protocols preventing the overprescribing of medications. Illinois is a leading example, as we will hear from Dr. Michael Naylor, whose office reviews all medication requests for children in foster care in Illinois. This effort has prevented over-medication of children, likely saving taxpayers money, but more importantly, resulting in better care for children. Other states, including Texas and Connecticut, have similar programs. And part of our task is to ensure that all states are taking the necessary steps and learning from each other's best practices. Ultimately, the best solution for children is to be in a permanent, loving home with parents who watch out for them each and every day. This subcommittee knows that and has focused its efforts during the past year in getting more foster youth into those sort of permanent, loving homes. And H.R. 3205, the Promoting Adoption and Legal Guardianship for Children in Foster Care Act, passed the House last year, incentivizes states to move more children, especially older children, into adoptive homes. And just last week, the House passed H.R. 4058, the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Improving Opportunities for Youth in Foster Care Act, which requires states to more quickly move children out of foster care into permanent homes. And I'm hopeful that we will enact these bills this year. That will help more children move from foster care into loving homes, improving their lives in many ways, vastly decreasing the likelihood of using or needing psychotropic drugs. We welcome all of our witnesses today, and we look forward to their testimony. And I was meeting today with one of the foster youths out there in the audience. Courtney's out there. She and I had a chance to talk, and she told her story of moving from foster home to foster home to foster home, and even living in a foster home that was not legally a foster home anymore, and state authorities didn't even know that it had been removed from the foster home approved list. So we have a lot of work to do in this area, and this is one of those issues that really tightly is wound into bringing better care to our children across this country. And I now yield time to Mr. Doggett for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly share all of the sentiments that you just expressed and appreciate this bipartisan inquiry. I think that while no doubt medication can be one appropriate tool in a treatment plan for some children, It has instead become the first line of consideration for too many children in our foster care system. The Congressional Research Service looked at the year 2010 and found that 40% of children in longer-term foster care over the age of 6 were using psychotropic medicines. That's a pretty staggering level. Other studies found the next year in 2011 that those who are enrolled in Medicaid, children in foster care were prescribed psychotropic medications at rates of 3 to 11 times higher than non-foster children. The pill is not the answer in many of these situations. Having been abused or neglected and then removed from their homes, every child coming into the foster care system has suffered some degree of trauma. We've heard firsthand in this committee about the problems with psychotropic drugs a couple of years ago and continue through our research to see other examples of that, and we've heard firsthand from foster children about the trauma and how it has impacted their lives. This issue was addressed in this committee when our colleague, Chairman McDermott, chaired the committee back in 2008 and required states to develop health oversight plans for children in foster care, including the oversight of prescription medicines. In 2011, Congress strengthened that provision to include specific protocols for reviewing the prescribing of these medications to foster children. I look forward to hearing from each of our witnesses on how child welfare and Medicaid policies have changed in response to these specific laws. My home state of Texas, with the leadership of CASA, the Court-Appointed Special Advocates, recently changed the law there and took a number of steps to prevent unnecessary over-medication of children in foster care, including the legislation that will give guardian ad litems a greater role in the oversight of these medications. Improved oversight of medications is only part of the solution. Children in foster care need access to comprehensive treatment for mental and emotional health needs, which requires additional efforts in both the Medicaid and the child welfare system. I appreciate the presence here today and the leadership for this hearing from our colleague Karen Bass of California, who heads our foster care caucus. The administration's budget calls for $750 million over the next 5 years toward this goal. This is an investment that is equal to about 1/4% of one of the measures that our committee approved earlier today. I believe that we do need to come together with common purpose and hear of any ways we can change the law in this area, but we also have to have the resources present to be able to get the job done effectively and not just respond after some crisis or horrible situation has hit the news media. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I look forward to hearing from all witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Doggett. I'd like to just mention briefly, I would like to thank Ms. Bass for her work in helping us organize this hearing and her work in helping foster children. It's a pleasure to have you attending our hearing this morning, and also a moment just to thank Mr. McDermott for his hard work as past chairman and past ranking member of this committee, and also Mr. Doggett for his support. So as you can all see, this is a bipartisan effort, rarely seen. We are together on this, and we are going to make a difference and help people. So thank you again, Mr. Doggett. Without objection, each member will have the opportunity to submit a written record and statement, and have it included in the record at this point. I want to remind our witnesses to please try and limit your testimony to 5 minutes. However, without objection, all of the written testimony will be made a part of the permanent record. And on our panel this afternoon, we'll be hearing from Juyen Chang, Associate Commissioner of the Children's Bureau, Administration for Children and Families, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services; Donna Zender-Houveneer, the Mockingbird Society; Dr. Phil McGraw, talk show host, Dr. Phil Show; Dr. Michael Taylor, MD, Associate Professor of Psychiatry, School of Medicine, University of Illinois at Chicago; and Stephen Lord, Director of Forensic Audits and Investigative Services, U.S. Government Accountability Office. I would like to mention that we have other experts in the audience who know a thing or two about foster care system because they have lived it. And as I mentioned just a little bit earlier, a lot of our foster youth are in the audience today, and I think we probably have over 60. And you know what? I'm going to do something a little bit unusual. I'm going to ask the foster kids, if they want to raise your hand or stand, because we want to give you a big applause, round of applause for your success. As you can see, they're not shy. We're so happy to have you here. So each of these youth have spent the morning with a member of Congress, and as I said, Courtney's and I got to spend a little time together and talk about my life and her life. We found some similarities as runaways, but I was fortunate enough to make it back to my home and not into a foster home. So thank you for coming today. Ms. Chang, please proceed with your testimony.
Chairman Reichert, Ranking Member Doggett, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. The administration is very concerned about the overmedication of children in the foster care system. We are grateful to you for having this hearing and bringing more attention to the issue. My name is Ju-Yun Chang, and I'm the Associate Commissioner of the Children's Bureau. I've worked as a national advocate on child welfare policies, both as a senior staff attorney at the Children's Defense Fund, as well as at Casey Family Programs Foundation, where I worked closely with state and local child welfare agencies. In my current role, I oversee the federal foster care and adoption assistance programs, as well as a range of prevention and post-permanency initiatives. At the Department of Health and Human Services, we are working with state child welfare agencies to ensure that vulnerable children in their care receive appropriate care and services, and that they are effectively monitoring for psychotropic medication use. Children who come into foster care often have been exposed to multiple traumas, including abuse and neglect and subsequent removal from their homes. The CDC's Adverse Childhood Experiences Study and other research tells us that the impacts of these negative life experiences affect children in all domains, from brain development to physical health, to how a young person reacts emotionally to various situations, and how they are or are not able to interact with others. We know from our research that children who enter foster care are at much higher risk for developing both physical and emotional disorders, especially traumatic stress, and the child welfare system currently struggles to fully meet their needs. If inadequately treated, these experiences can lead to worsening health conditions and may hinder a foster parent's ability to meet the child's needs, potentially resulting in multiple placements for that child. This lack of stability can lead to increasingly restrictive and costly placements and make it more difficult for that child to find a permanent, loving family. These undesired outcomes can negatively impact the well-being of children and youth in foster care and also mean additional cost for the child welfare and other public systems. The need for action in this area is clear. Our own data show that 18% of children in foster care are taking one or more psychotropic medications, and the GAO has estimated an even higher rate of 21 to 39%. Children in care are prescribed psychotropic medications at far higher rates than other children served by Medicaid, and often in amounts that exceed those indicated by FDA-approved labeling for such drugs. We appreciate the important role that Congress, led by this committee, has played in bringing attention to these issues. Specifically, the 2008 enactment of Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act, which required for the first time ongoing oversight and coordination of healthcare services for children in foster care, to the more recent enactment of the Child and Family Services Improvement and Innovation Act in 2011 that requires states to report to HHS protocols they have in place for monitoring the use of psychotropic medications. We have worked across the agency and collaboratively across the department to provide guidance to states on monitoring the use of psychotropic medications for children in foster care. And we have also shared information about evidence-based interventions that address the underlying issues of trauma. We reviewed the progress that had been made and saw that there was a practice gap that needed to be filled. Child welfare agencies often did not have access to adequate research-based, non-pharmaceutical mental health treatments, and as a result, often rely on medication as the first line of treatment. If we are serious about reducing the use of psychotropic medication, we must also ensure that child welfare agencies have access to evidence-based interventions. Therefore, along with CMS, we developed the proposal you see in the President's fiscal year 2015 budget, one we hope you will give thoughtful consideration to. This proposal presents a concerted effort to reduce overprescription of psychotropic medications for children by increasing the availability of evidence-based psychosocial treatments that meet the complex needs that children who have experienced maltreatment often have. Increased access to timely and effective screening, assessment, and non-pharmaceutical treatment will reduce over-reliance on psychotropic medication, improve child emotional and behavioral health, and increase the likelihood that children in foster care will exit to positive, permanent settings with the life skills and resources they need to be successful. The administration looks forward to working with you to address this crucial issue and improve services to some of our most vulnerable young people. Again, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'd be happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Chang. And before Ms. Huvenier begins, I'd just like to point out that she is quite a remarkable young woman. And as a 21-year-old alumni of Washington's foster care system, she spent 7 years in foster care, primarily in Pierce County in western Washington, which is just south of Seattle area. She's become a strong advocate for foster care reforms, working with the Mockingbird Society, an advocacy organization for young people impacted by foster care and homelessness in Washington State. And I know she hopes her advocacy will improve the foster care system for young people who come after her, and I believe that you will. Thank you for being with us today, and you can go ahead. She says she's not nervous, so I told her I was. But go ahead, you have 5 minutes, Ms. Hooven.
Thank you, Chairman Riker, Ranking Member Doggett, and committee members for giving me the opportunity to speak. My name is Donna Zinder-Hovenair. I am 21 years old and have spent 7 years in foster care in Washington State. On my 18th birthday, I aged out of foster care and was released after spending 7 months in an adolescent psychiatric hospital. My hope is that the government will quit spending millions of dollars forcing kids like me to take drugs they do not need and give them things they do need, such as a volunteer CASA who believes in them, skilled mental health professionals who they can talk to, and most of all, loving, compassionate family that believes in them. I was ordered into the psychiatric hospital after my social worker told the court I had borderline personality disorder, major depressive disorder, and suicidal ideation. I was forced to take strong doses of psychotropic medication and told I could probably never live on my own. Only my CASA and the man who became my father agreed with me that I did not need the drugs. The 7 months I was locked up and forced to take these drugs felt like being in jail. After reviewing my records, I discovered that the foster care system paid $15,000 a month, about $120,000 total, to lock me up and take these drugs. Last year, I earned my Certified Nurse's Aide certificate after successfully completing 2 years of classes at Bellingham Technical College. My GPA, it was a 3.92. I'm currently enrolled at Whatcom Community College in Bellingham, Washington. Thanks to federal and state funding for former foster youth, I was able to complete all my prerequisites required for a nursing degree. I am hoping to be accepted into an RN program to pursue my dreams of becoming a nurse. I have lived independently for more than 2 years. I've been off all psychiatric medications for more than 3 years. I've never felt better or happier. What happened How did I transition from being diagnosed a mentally disabled foster youth to a model student and productive member of society? I don't have time to tell my whole story. Despite everything I experienced growing up, I know I was lucky. When I was 16, a man who recently became my father and is here with me today adopted my then 10-year-old brother from foster care. My younger brother was also forced to take strong doses of psychiatric drugs. He's been off them since his adoption more than 5 years ago. My dad hired an attorney to fight the state's plan to transfer me to an adult psychiatric facility. He picked me up on my 18th birthday and sent me to live with his friends. They are now my family too, so today it feels like I have 2 dads and a mom. The next 6 months were among the most difficult in my life. Because of my diagnosis in foster care, we couldn't find a psychiatrist willing to take me off the medications, so we had to do it ourselves. This meant battling many intense withdrawal symptoms. One of the medications I was on can cause seizures, resulting in death if not carefully discontinued. My dad wrote a book about adopting my brother from foster care, and some of the professionals who read it advised him on how to get me off these medications. 6 months after aging out of foster care, I managed to graduate from Mount Baker High School with my class. A few months later, I moved into my own apartment. My new family helped me find an excellent therapist who supported me in my decision to get off these medications. Today, I'm able to talk about my feelings, but when I was in the psychiatric hospital, I was so drugged up I didn't even know how I felt. My twin sister said I was like a zombie. I know some of the kids I was locked up with needed medications. They heard voices that weren't there and got violent sometimes. But I believe many of the foster kids were like me and needed loving parents to guide them. When I think about the government spending over $120,000 locking me up and forcing me to take these drugs, it makes me very angry. I wish that the money could have been spent helping foster youth. Despite all of this, I've been so lucky. A few months ago, on the same day as my brother's adoption, 5 years ago, my dad adopted my twin sister and me. What really helped me get off the medication was being surrounded by people who loved me and wanted to help me. I believe what most foster youth need is love, not drugs. Although I can never get back the 7 months that I was locked up and forced to take these drugs, I hope that telling my story here today and continuing to work with the Mockingbird Society will help other youth like me and encourage change. In closing, I want to thank the Mockingbird Society for making it possible for me to come from Seattle to be here today. They are an awesome youth advocacy organization that helps young people share our experiences about foster care and gives us a chance to be heard. Thank you, Chairman Reichert, for inviting me here today. I want to thank you for all the work that you do for foster youth. Dr. Phil, I also want to thank you for everything you've done. And I am grateful to my CASA for being the person who knew me and told the court that I did not need these drugs, and for all my family, my twin sister, and my therapist for supporting me to get off these medications. Thank you.
You did awesome. Do you want to come up here and take my place and run the rest of the show?
No, thank you.
No. Thank you for your testimony, and thank you for your work. Dr. McGraw, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Reichert, Ranking Member Doggett, and esteemed members of the committee, I wish I didn't have to follow this young lady. That's a tough act, to say the least. I am honored to be invited here to talk about the possible misuse of these psychotropic drugs. They are all too often prescribed to America's foster children. Look, these drugs can change and even save lives. There's no question about it. But when it comes to these vulnerable children, these drugs are just too often misused as chemical straitjackets. It's just a haphazard attempt to simply control and suppress undesirable behavior rather than treat it, nurture it, and develop these treasured young people. And simply put, it just makes them less inconvenient. It just makes them less inconvenient so they don't take as much energy to manage. And you have my written statement, and I kind of want to begin where it leads off, because I believe that 80% of all questions are really statements in disguise, and I think everybody here already agrees These drugs are flowing too much. There's just no question about that. You know the numbers. The real question is why? Why is this happening? I mean, 3 times as many foster children as their counterparts are getting these drugs. 40% of them are on 3 classes of drugs. Some are on 5 classes of drugs. This is polypharmacy. And is there more psychopathology with these foster children? Of course there is. They have more abuse and neglect that they've had to go through. 80% are diagnosed with mental illness as opposed to 20% in the general population, but this is no justification. And I've been working with this population for 5 years, for 5 decades. Robin and I have been national spokespersons for CASA for a number of years. Their budget has been cut, which I was just broke my heart to see. These kids face problems that you're not going to fix by throwing drugs at them. And a lot of them don't even take the drugs. They sell them. Dr. Charles Sophie is with me here today. He's the chief medical director for the LA County DCFS, the largest in the country. He told me within the last month, near a shelter in LA, some of those children tried to sell him their psychotropic drugs, not knowing he was the medical director. And more than once in an hour, they're trying to sell the drugs. If they do take them, are they less inconvenient? Maybe, but it's not convenience without consequences. They should never be used without evidence-based research. There should be proper diagnostics done and appropriate monitoring done, and it should always be in conjunction with evidence-based therapies. And anything less, we just have to be honest, we're sabotaging these kids. We're just flat out sabotaging them. And in my view, this is like pulling a thread. The entire system is flawed. It's not just the drugs, the entire system is flawed. Do we need to turn off the flood of drugs? Yes. But the problem is we got a reverse incentive system here. It's a system where the government continues to pay for the drugs. We say you shouldn't give them, but yet they continue to be compensated for them. And these foster children, the more labels they get, the more drugs they are on, the more money they get to take care of that child. So they're actually paid for pathology. The more scripts, the less treatment. The more scripts, the less energy. And so it just becomes an assembly line, high volume, move them in, move them out process. And these children deserve better than that. Real treatment takes high energy. It's low volume. I mean, you got to have more people. It takes more time. But we've got too many doctors with insufficient training in these drugs. They don't know what the drugs do. Most of us, if we're honest, we have to tell you, we don't know why the drugs work when they do work. We don't know the agent of action, the agent of change. But we have too many doctors with insufficient training about these drugs that are prescribing them. And there's no follow-up because the foster parents change. So there's no long-term follow on this. And then the therapists they do get, they change. You've got children with detachment problems, attachment disorders, detachment problems, and we rotate their therapist in and out. As soon as they bond with one, then they're faced with another one. So it just becomes a serious problem. I've been in this situation, hopefully, fortunately not as bad as some of these children, but I was homeless when I was 15 years old. I was living on the streets in Kansas City. I was living in a car. We finally got a room at the YMCA, my dad and I, and then ultimately an apartment where we got an apartment, but we had no utilities because we didn't have money for the deposit. So we froze to death in the dark from 4:30 on. But I tell you what happened to me. Nobody ran at me with a handful of drugs. I fortunately had a football coach and some others who taught me about responsibility, taught me about the things to do that were important. And that's what CASAs do with these children. That's what therapists involved with evidence-based treatments would do with these children. But we've got to stop the flow of drugs, and we got to focus on reunification. We just got to try and get these children back home. This system is broken, and it is flawed. And psychology has made great strides. We truly do have alternatives to offer these children, and without the side effects that the drugs have. but it takes time, and it takes money, and it takes a completely different model than what we have right now. And so I'm obviously very passionate about this. I just feel so strongly that these children need somebody to put an arm around their shoulder, somebody to help them, rather than just throw drugs at them. And there's nothing better for these children to be able to look themselves in the mirror and say, I did this, I found my way, I got my coping skills. So I'll stop. I want to thank the committee for inviting me to participate. A wise man once said, well, actually it was me that said it, you can't change what you don't acknowledge. And this committee is making a bold acknowledgement of this problem. And so I'm happy to answer any questions. I have Dr. Frank Lawless, the chairman of my advisory board here. Dr. Charles Sophie, who I mentioned earlier, is here. Dr. Marty Greenberg, our director of professional affairs, is here. We're all here to answer any questions anybody's got. We want to change this model. We want to start taking care of these kids. They've been through enough.
Thank you. Well, we didn't even have to hold up an applause card on that one. I wish we had a half-hour show, Doctor, but that was great testimony. Thank you so much. You and I have a couple of things in common. One, I ran away and lived in my car. It was a 1956 Mercury for me. I don't know what you had, but
55 Chevy, no reverse. Had no reverse, but it did go forward.
and it was a football coach that came to help me too. So thank you for your testimony, and Dr. Naylor, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Reichert, Ranking Member Doggett, and members of the Subcommittee on Human Resources, before I start, I really want to lodge a complaint against who seated me here. He only had to follow one really incredible testimony. I have to follow two. I hope I can live up to it. Thank you for inviting me to testify before the committee. I'm truly honored at the opportunity to address the issue of psychotropic medications for kids in the foster care system. We've already heard children in foster care, by definition, Medicaid eligible, are at higher risk for developing severe emotional disturbances and utilize mental health services at higher rates than other Medicaid eligible youth. They are prescribed more medications at higher rates and at higher doses. In a way, these are not particularly surprising findings. As a population, foster children have multiple risk factors that predispose them to severe emotional disturbances and psychiatric illnesses, including often a genetic predisposition to mental illness, in utero exposure to drugs and alcohol, the adverse effects of growing up in poverty, a history of severe trauma, disrupted early attachments, and multiple placement disruptions, to name just a few. To complicate matters, there's a fragmented medical and psychiatric care system and an absence, in the most part, of a consistent caregiver to provide consent for and longitudinal oversight of their ongoing care. Despite all of this, I do contend that psychotropic medications are often an important component of a comprehensive psychosocial treatment plan that really is based on a good biopsychosocial understanding of these kids and their situation. I will describe how a program designed and implemented by the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services to provide consent for and oversight of psychotropic medications in foster children has resulted in more effective, safer, and more cost-effective care. In July 2007, I testified in front of the committee under Congressman McDermott and to advocate both for the oversight of psychotropic medications for foster children and to describe a program, the DCFS Centralized Psychotropic Medication Consent Program. Illinois state law prohibits the administration of psychotropic medications to foster children without the consent of the DCFS guardian. And this is a centralized office compared to other consent programs across the nation. To support the consent process, DCFS contracted with UIC to provide an independent review of all psychotropic medication consent requests to determine the appropriateness of the proposed treatment. Utilizing an extensive database consisting of consent data, Medicaid pharmacy payment claims, and data from the statewide automated child welfare information system, we can monitor an individual's medication history over time, across placements, and across providers, and we can monitor statewide patterns of psychotropic medication use. We believe that this prospective psychotropic medication consent and oversight process has resulted in higher quality and more cost-effective care, as evidenced by the implementation of a program that provides specialty evaluations of and evidence-based psychosocial treatments for preschool-age children in an effort to decrease reliance on psychotropic medications. Improved continuity of care, preventing, therefore, the use of medications that have perhaps proven ineffective or been associated with significant adverse effects in previous trials. Increased adherence to evidence-based prescribing for the treatment of psychiatric disorders, in the meantime resulting in a cost savings. A substantial decrease in the concurrent prescription of 2 or more antipsychotic medications, improved monitoring of adverse side effects, for example, documenting the weight gain associated with second-generation antipsychotics, and devising a policy linking consent for these medications to appropriate medication oversight in the doctor's office. And finally, improved safety of pharmacotherapy through the prevention of potentially serious and even fatal drug-drug interactions. In conclusion, I will reiterate my 2007 testimony and support for the appropriate oversight for the use of psychotropic medications in foster children. As shown by the Illinois experience, a well-designed and implemented medication consent and oversight program can improve the quality of care and increase cost effectiveness. Again, I want to thank the committee for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I will gladly answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Naylor. You did just fine.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Lord, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Riker, Ranking Member Doggett, and other distinguished members of the committee. I'm really honored to be here on this distinguished panel to discuss GAO's work examining the use of psychotropic medications in the foster children community. As we've already heard today, foster children are especially vulnerable population, and in 2012, there were over 400,000 children in the foster care system, some of whom had experienced neglect and physical abuse. Today, I would like to focus on 2 key issues. The first is the extent to which children in foster care are prescribed psychotropic medications, and secondly, federal and state oversight of these practices. First key point I'd like to make is that children in foster care take psychotropic medications at higher rates than other children. As we heard from the administration witness, 18% of foster children were taking a psychotropic medication at the time they were surveyed, and this compares to about 6% for non-institutionalized children in Medicaid nationwide and about 5% for children in private insurance plans. It's also important to note that within certain populations of foster children, for example, those who lived in group homes or residential treatment centers, the rates are much higher. The data shows that 48% of those living in residential homes and treatment centers were taking psychotropic medications. But another important caveat is these rates do not necessarily imply inappropriate prescribing practices based on the medical experts we consulted. In some cases, these rates could be due to foster children's greater mental health needs and perhaps greater exposure to trauma. The second key point I'd like to make is the federal and state oversight of psychotropic use among foster children has improved over the last few years, although we wholeheartedly agree additional guidance and attention is needed. In 2011, we reported that states monitoring psychotropic use among foster children fell short of the best practice guidelines espoused by the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. Thus, we recommended that HHS endorse additional best practice guidance to help ensure states were properly overseeing the use of these drugs. And the good news is HHS agreed with our recommendation, and ACF has issued directives to states to establish better protocols for monitoring their use. And this includes a key April 2012 program instruction designed to achieve this goal. However, as we highlighted in our new report we issued just last week, additional guidance is needed as some states transition away from the so-called fee-for-service arrangement to managed care organizations to deliver these prescription drug benefits. And the need for additional guidance is underscored also by our detailed case study reviews of 24 case studies we did as part of our current work. In some instances, the experts we consulted, including Dr. Naylor, I should point out, found good supporting documentation in the case files for the use. However, in other areas, there was a question. You know, we found some supporting documentation, but it raised questions about whether some children were receiving the proper therapies and treatments, such as evidence-based therapies that may have been useful. In closing, federal and state governments have actively taken a number of important steps to better oversee the prescribing of these drugs. That's the key message of the body of work GEO has issued in this area. But however, again, as we recently highlighted, additional steps are needed to help ensure there's good oversight and monitoring of this drug use. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my statement. I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Lord. Thank you all for your testimony. We now move into the question and answer phase of the hearing. I'll begin. My first question is for Ms. Hovener. I just want to thank you again for being here and having the courage to tell your story, and also thank you for all the work that you're doing to help other children in foster care. And you talked about a little bit about how you succeeded, and you know what helped you, and really you focused on people need love, children need love versus drugs. And I wonder if you could just tell me a little bit more about. Now we know your family was there, they loved you, your cost advisor was there. How did you finally get to the point where you were being able to pull yourself out of that, or have your family pull yourself out of that treatment center?
So on my 18th birthday, I aged out of foster care.
Right.
When I turned 18, they could no longer keep me there. But however, the
drugs.
In the psychiatric facility, they could no longer keep me there.
Right.
And since I was no longer there, I didn't want to take the medications to start out with. So when I left the facility, I'm like, okay, I'm never taking another psychotropic medication because I do not like the way they made me feel, and I've never liked it. And so that was when I decided I didn't need the medication. I already knew I didn't need it, but that was the starting point with, okay, I want to get off. How do I do this? And when I moved up to Bellingham, we couldn't find a psychiatrist to take me off because they looked into my records from the psychiatric facility, and they said that they didn't want to take me off because I was a liability, that I might do something. But they didn't know me before I was on the medication. Before I was on the medication, I was a normal teenager, being a normal rebellious teenager. But apparently when you're in foster care and you're rebellious, you get medicated. So just having my family, my adopted family and my new family just support me, and they're like, okay, we want to do what you want to do. We're here. Just let us know anything we can do. And having a private paid therapist was a big deal to me because this therapist knew me and wanted to support me in getting off. And she wasn't one of the therapists that were like, oh, we're leaving you on this. We want to keep you on this. So I think that was a big difference.
How do you think we can help other foster kids?
I believe the government can help other foster kids by, I don't know if it's already a thing or not, but implementing the foster child, no matter what, has the right to request a second opinion from a doctor or a psychiatrist, no matter if it's a private paid therapist, private paid psychiatrist, and in addition, different forms of therapy besides just pharmaceutical therapy. Like, there's many therapies out there. I don't know them all, but those are just a couple of my ideas. Thank you.
Thank you. Good job. Dr. Naylor, Illinois has the 5th largest foster care caseload in the country with about 17,000 children in foster care. That program you administer oversees the prescription of psychotropic drugs to all of these children in foster care. How much does this program cost annually? You know what the cost is annually?
I write the budget, and it's budget time, so I have a pretty good clue.
Yeah.
It runs about $1.1 million. That's how much we've requested. We typically run it on about $900,000.
And how is your program funded?
It's funded as a contract through the Department of Children and Family Services. The Children and Family Services receives funding from the state. In fact, their funding from the state is actually quite generous because of a consent decree from early 90s. And some of the money comes from various federal grants. I can't speak to how the money from DCFS comes to us, but it's either paid through general funds, which would be through the legislature, or it comes from children's services funds, which are specifically earmarked to pay quicker. In Illinois, that's a very important factor, I think, but pays quite a bit quicker than general funds.
Okay. Well, what are some of the key outcomes that sort of tell you that your efforts have been successful, that they're making a difference?
Well, I think there's several. One, in the written testimony, which I apologize, it didn't translate well from the Word document to the PDF, so there's some really weird things that happened when it was transferred to PDF. But you can see that there was, over time, a decrease in the use of Prozac or fluoxetine. And after the black box warning and after the warning regarding Paxil, we made the determination based on pretty sound evidence that fluoxetine should be the first drug of choice. And by changing our review process, we were able to do something that I don't think made the drug companies all that happy, which was we increased the rate of generic medication, fluoxetine, at the expense of brand name medications that were less effective. So one of the things that we were able to do was to increase evidence-based prescribing at a cost savings, because the medication with the greatest evidence for it was also the medication that was the cheapest. We were able also to show a decline in the use of antipsychotic polypharmacy, and these numbers actually are even more dramatic than you see in the written testimony because of the way we analyze this. We were very conservative.
You answered my last question to you. You just mentioned cost saving. Okay. Dr. McGraw, you've spent your career focusing on mental health issues and how to appropriately address them. What do you believe is the best way to raise awareness of this issue so children are better protected from being prescribed these drugs that really aren't going to help them? What's the best way to get the word? One of these, of course, is today's hearing with your presence that adds to it, but do you have some ideas on that?
Well, I do. I think we need to keep just ringing the bell over and over because it's out of sight, out of mind. And I think so often these children become invisible, and their treatment or their absence of treatment become invisible because they're just simply taken out of the mainstream. And I think that's why I said a hearing like we're having today is so important. We talk about this on the Dr. Phil platform. We talk about it on the doctors, the kind of the medical version of our show, and people care about this. Chairman Reichert, I know when we've had a call to action for CASA volunteers, it's just been overwhelming. I mean, we've been able to generate close to $90 million in volunteer services just from asking people to come forward and get involved. People want to get involved, they don't know how. And that's why something like a CASA is so important. For you and I, we had a football coach that kind of stepped up and jerked a knot in our tail and said, you know, get in class and be out of here at practice. But, you know, you look at all of the psychological research, and I don't think there's anything more powerful for these children than a caring adult that puts their arm around their shoulder and says, I'm going to help you navigate this maze. And so I think we just have to tell people about it, and we've got to tell them something they can do. Because if we get more adults involved in their lives, then these drugs are going to start to go away, because there's going to be somebody there that says, this is just a normal kid, a typical kid that's grown up in atypical circumstances. And we need to teach them, not medicate them. And I think that only happens when, you know, my dad used to say, nothing makes the crops grow like the shadow of the owner. And it's the same way with your kids. I mean, nothing protects your child than their biological parent, but if you don't have that, have a caring adult there that will pay attention to what's happening. And, you know, that's what happened to this courageous young woman here. We've got to have a call to action to get more people involved. And if you can't be a foster parent and bring children into your home, then you can be a CASA, which means you just navigate maybe 2 children a year through the process and watch over them, even if you can't open your home. If you don't have money to give, you can at least do that. So we just got to tell people what they can do to become involved.
Thank you. Mr. Doggett, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your insightful and moving testimony. There's no doubt that everyone up here on this dais shares your concern. The question is whether or not we will take the action to do something to change anything. And that whether that action will occur in a meaningful way is far from certain in this Congress. Mr. Chairman, I would ask in that regard unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from over 100 child advocacy organizations urging support for the administration's budget proposal to reduce the over-medication of foster children through a new demonstration project involving both child welfare and Medicaid agencies.
Without objection.
And Dr. Phil, I see that your foundation is among the organizations that signed that letter, and you've already talked about it. All of us are moved when we hear the stories from our CASA volunteers. I know I have been in Austin, in San Antonio. They do extraordinary work, but we can't solve this problem with just volunteers without resources, as you've indicated. You said, and I think I got it down, it takes time and it takes money and it takes a completely different model. If you would just outline why you think it would be valuable to have these additional resources and attempt to have a demonstration project to help us combat the overprescribing of these medications to children in foster care.
Well, Congressman Doggett, thank you for the question. And let me say, I think the worst thing we could do is throw more money at the model we have now.
Right.
If we throw more money to fund Medicaid or state agencies to keep writing these prescriptions and medicating these children, I think that would be disastrous. It would be like throwing gas on a fire. What it takes, and this is where money can be spent, is if you now have actual live people that will sit down and counsel these folks, give them the coping skills, the organizational skills, teach them how to talk to themselves about what's happened to them in their lives. I spoke at a luncheon earlier today with the shadow foster kids here. What a great group, by the way. What an audience. You want to speak to those kids, let me tell you. But you know, I said to them, sometimes you have to give yourself what you wish you could get from someone else. You know, maybe you don't have a parent there to put their arms around you and tell you how proud they are of you. But sometimes you have to give that to yourself. But they can't do that without having someone unravel this emotional ball of yarn for them. They've been abandoned, they've been neglected, they've been abused. Somebody has to tell them, what do you say to yourself about that? And psychology has made such wonderful advances with evidence-based therapies that give the kids the coping skills, the tools to do that. That's where the money should be spent. That's where the money will be spent with a new model, and that's why I support that, if it's done in that way. But it takes manpower. It takes manpower. And you're right, you can't do it with all volunteers. And sometimes the problems are over the volunteers' head. I mean, just over their skill set. If you've got someone that truly does have a mental illness that requires professional intervention, all the love in the world's not going to fix that. You need professional intervention to do that. And that's why you can't do it with all volunteer. And that's why the money would be well spent if it's not spent pouring more drugs on the problem.
And Ms. Chang, let me ask you to respond on that also with specifics, because clearly we don't want to just pour more money into buying drugs. We'd like to have some cost savings there. But why is it that additional resources are needed to get this other model going? Can you expand on what Dr. Phil has just told us?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. I think when we think about a system that functions effectively, you need at a minimum 3 core components. You need the ability to screen and assess so you can identify what's actually happening in that child's life and what their needs are. You need to then be able to connect what you've identified to appropriate evidence-based interventions like Dr. Phil was talking about. And finally, you have to be able to monitor that child and follow them to make sure that that intervention is actually working for that individual child. We do this in regular medicine all the time, right? If you go to your doctor, they're going to prescribe something for you. They tell you to come back and follow up, make sure that medicine worked. If it didn't, they'll try something else. Far too often in child welfare, we're missing, at a minimum, those first 2 components, right? We don't have adequate screening and assessment tools that actually can identify what trauma that child has experienced and what that's done to that child's cognitive, social, emotional, mental health well-being. So we miss that first part. And even when we do have the capacity to measure what's going on in that child's life, what we have learned from the local jurisdictions is that they do not have access to the evidence-based interventions. And so there are many missing components, and that's why this demonstration is really designed to help local jurisdictions who want to do the right thing have the resources to either to create for the first time or scale up evidence-based interventions. We know what works in the field, and often, as folks have said, it really is about family-based care, community-based care with mental health professionals who are trained in these evidence-based interventions.
Congressman Doggett, I also want to add, you're not really talking about new money here, by the way, because what hasn't been talked about is these psychotropic drugs have addictive elements to them, and these children are at higher risk for addiction problems later in life if they've been on these drugs or abusing these actual drugs. And you're going to have to deal with that down the road if you don't deal with it here. If you take the drugs out and you put the right treatment and therapies in, you may spend that money doing that now, but you're not going to spend that money with lost productivity in society with someone that has an addiction problem later in life. So it's like pay me now or pay me later. So you would do a whole lot better off to do it now and prevent the problems, because one thing we know is when children get addicted to drugs, their development stops. Their mental, emotional development stops. Educational deficits set in. Just because these were written with a prescription instead of on the street doesn't make their impact any different. The educational deficits, the developmental deficits, those things become profound, and you're going to pay for those later. And that's why it's important to do it now. And whether it's in reunification with the family or it's with these foster parents, most of which are absolute heroes stepping up in these kids' lives. So, you know, you're not really talking about new money here. It's just you're going to spend it here, you're going to spend it there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank everybody for being here. But if I'm listening to you, I may be hearing it correctly, maybe, Ms. Chang, you maybe help me on this. It seems to me that because we've had such a huge breakdown in the family unit, that we have more of these children that are out there that cannot be taken care of by a mom and a dad and what we would consider a traditional family unit. So overwhelming. I was reading the numbers, 400,000 children right now in foster care. That says 2012. I don't know where it is today.
Right.
So is this, if you were to break it down demographically,
Sure.
are these from lower income or lower middle income people? Where are these children coming from?
Sure. So you're correct. We have a little less than 400,000 children in foster care today. I want to note that that's a huge mark of progress in the system. That's a reduction from over 500,000 children in care just about 10 years ago. So the system has made a difference. But you're right. These are young people who come from often low socioeconomic backgrounds. They come from challenging neighborhoods. And the abuse and neglect they experienced before they came into care, and then the trauma of coming into care, even if they had to leave an abusive and neglectful family, coming into care can be traumatic. But most of these kids can be cared for in a foster home with a relative, and most of them, in fact, are. The great majority of our kids are placed with relatives or other foster families. And many of them don't have serious mental illnesses. Most of our kids have trauma symptoms that often are misdiagnosed as mental illness, and because we fail to intervene early on, they can escalate into much more serious behavioral.
I guess that's where my question comes. So who does the intervention? Who determines that an intervention is necessary? And I think that's the part that bothers. I've got 8 grandchildren right now, and 9 and 10 are coming. There's no 2 of them that are alike.
That's right.
Some are more challenging than others.
That's right.
The ones that are the most challenging, I wouldn't say his problem is he needs medication. I would say maybe he needs a little more parenting. But I worry about it. Ms. Hovner, you refer to now you actually have 2 families, 2 dads and a mom. I think that's interesting because you don't say I have 2 people taking care of me. You say the term that most of us identify growing up. I got a mom, I got a dad. I've got people who care about me. I got people who love me. I got people who I can go to when I need to go to them. I keep worrying about this, and maybe you can weigh in. I know your father's with you now. Your dad's with you now. But I don't know about your early life. What happened that your little brother was 10-year-old. He was also in a foster home. Now, did you say you had a twin sister?
I do, yes.
Okay. Was your twin sister in a foster home?
Yes.
Okay. So your whole family?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So that's got to be very difficult. Dr. Phil, you deal with folks all the time. I've watched you a couple of times on TV. I don't have the chance to watch as much as maybe I'd like to, but I see this breakdown of the family is what I see going on. And I think we keep looking for government programs that somehow will do the job that families no longer do. I grew up in an altogether different time. And I would tell you, when I talk to my friends, we agree on one thing. We grew up in the greatest towns at the greatest times with the greatest parents, preachers, teachers, coaches you could ever imagine, and a family support system. We didn't have as much of a support system government supplied. We had it family supplied, and that's the part that bothers me. I look at a society that's going more to government for answers than it is to internally families making decisions, families deciding what to do to help a child, families being involved in the final determination of who goes on what or what they get prescribed to them. You see it in great numbers. You all see it in great numbers. But I keep coming, if our families continue to break down the way they're breaking down, there's not enough money in the world out there to take care of these children that are just out there going along aimlessly.
Well, that's why it's so important to focus on reunification. And by the way, I'd be happy to get you a DVR so you could watch more often. Since
No. That's okay. Thank you. I appreciate that.
No, that's the whole reason. And when I say the foster system is broken, the goal has to be reunification. We've got to restore the American family unit in America. I mean, we've become a much more transient society. We used to go down and play on the corner and then go home. But now we go to Target schools and different places around. It is a different time, but we've got to reinstitute the family unit in America, and that is breaking down. And I see it more and more every day, where parents drop their child off at school, expect them to be raised. That can't happen. It's got to start at home. As parents, the same-sex parent is the most powerful role model in any child's life, and that's where it begins. And you cannot abdicate that role to anyone, and that's why reunification has got to be such a goal in this foster.
I agree with you, but it's the socialization process we're missing out on today. I got to tell you, the way I grew up, there wasn't anybody substituting for my mother and my dad, and Ms. Hovner, I congratulate you on getting through what you've gotten through. But I think there's too many children out there who do not have the benefit of having a strong nuclear family, and I think that's the #1 problem. If you don't have a strong nuclear family, you don't have a strong faith-based folks, you're not going to be able to get through it on your own. You just can't learn it by yourself through a book or through a program. Thank you.
Mr. Griffin, you're right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I'm from Arkansas, and we have had quite a bit of success in Arkansas dealing with this particular problem. And you know, there's a lot of jokes and a lot of things said about Congress, but I'll tell you that a lot of the progress we've made has been because of the laws that we've been able to get in place. And you know, I was just reminded of 2011, which was my first year serving here. We had the Child and Family Services Improvement Innovation Act, which deals specifically with the protocol for prescribing psychotropic medication for children. When I look at some of the results of what's gone on in Arkansas, it's been incredible. And it no doubt has been encouraged and in some cases mandated by the federal government. But the boots on the ground, as we say in the Army, has been at the state level. And some of the numbers here, well, let me just say a number of specific edits, or as they're called, or changes were put in place. One of them in particular was having child psychiatrists review all requests for psychotropic medications for children under 5, and a whole host of things. But the numbers are staggering. There was a reduction for foster care children under 6 years old, a reduction of 86%. Well, that's almost elimination. For non-foster care, 92%. So there is a gap. There is a gap between the non-foster care children and the foster care children. When you get to 6 to 12 years, a reduction of 38% for foster care, 49% for non-foster. So there is something that works here, it seems to me. And I think the point that Dr. Phil, you made, and some others, and some folks up here made, is a good one, and that is, look, we've seen that throwing money at a problem doesn't work. The VA has been getting more money for administration after administration. I think we've tripled the money for the VA in the last little over a decade, and it's still a disaster in many ways. And so we've got to make sure that we're funding the right things, and that we're funding things on the ground, not more administrators, and I think that is critically important. Now, the one thing, a couple things to ask here. First of all, Dr. Naylor, in Arkansas, there's still a gap between, even though there have been significant reductions and great, very effective reforms, still a gap between foster care children and non-foster care children. And Dr. Phil mentioned earlier that there are certain problems or patterns with foster care children. I think you said that there are more mental health problems as a percentage than in the general population. Maybe that explains the gap. Dr. Naylor, could you, and I see Dr. Phil shaking his head, Dr. Naylor, if you could speak to that, then Dr. McGraw, Dr. Phil, whichever one you want to go by. If apparently you've chosen Dr. Phil, but if y'all could both speak to that, what's the gap? Why is there a gap? So when we see a reduction, the reduction is not as much with the foster care population as it is with the non-foster care.
Well, and I have how many minutes to answer that?
I'll give you as much as you want. He may not.
Excellent. All right. I think that there's several reasons. I summarized some of them in my testimony. I really think that these youngsters, you cannot, first of all, pathologize kids in foster care or foster children, because the vast majority of them are able to carry out their roles that they're supposed to be carrying out, being part of a foster family, being part of a home of relative, going to school and things like that. But there is a subgroup, and I think that this is a larger group in foster kids than in the general population. I was asked by Brian Samuels, who came from Illinois, actually, and he asked me if I really believed that there was a higher rate of mental illness in foster kids. And my answer to him was, if you really wanted to come up with a model for developing mental illness in a population, that's the perfect model. You have kids who, a subpopulation anyway, are born to very impulsive, very aggressive, sometimes mentally ill, very often substance abusing, and even sociopathic parents. Strike one. Strike two. In these families, very often there is neglect. Neglect is probably worse in some ways even than physical abuse is. Physical and sexual abuse. There's often in utero exposure to drugs, which, between tobacco and alcohol, you've got the two biggest risk factors for screwing up a kid's brain. And we continue on through disruption of the primary attachment. And you look at these kids and you think, how can you possibly love a mom who treats you like this or a dad who treats you like this? But they do, and that's what they know. And I think the major trauma in the child welfare system actually is when you take the kids and how you take the kids into custody. And, people talk about the trauma of taking kids out of the home, but let me paint a picture for you. You're going to school. All of a sudden, the police come to you at the school. They pick you up, chuck you in the back seat of the car, bring you off to some strange place. Now, if you look at this from an evolutionary point of view, abduction equals death. And so when you are responding to this as a child, you're not responding to just, oh, what a bummer, you were taken away from your family. You're responding to a potentially life-threatening situation. I mean, that's what your brain is telling you. And I think that we end up then seeing incredible sadness, and maybe even more than that, a howling rage for some of these kids at being taken out of their families. And then the first foster homes sometimes stick, but for a lot of these kids, there's multiple placement disruptions, and every single disruption that you have is accompanied by a decrease in sense of self-worth and an increase in behavioral problems. And so we have the perfect system for developing emotional, behavioral, and psychiatric problems.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask that
I think this is an important question. The time has gone to almost 3 minutes over. Dr. Naylor, you did an outstanding job. I happen to have been one of those police officers years ago that was put in those positions, and I'll allow Dr. Phil McGraw to respond in a soundbite, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'll be as quick as I can. I don't disagree with anything Dr. Naylor just said, but I might approach him from a different standpoint. Being a foster child is a social circumstance. It is not a mental illness. It is a social circumstance. You do not treat a social circumstance with a drug. You have to fix the underlying problem, and you've got to do a differential diagnosis. You got to say, is the etiology here organic? I mean, is there a biochemical imbalance that needs to be corrected inside the body? Or has someone gone through some type of psychological trauma that has threatened their safety and their security and their self-worth and their ability to predict the consequences of their life and their action? And if that's the case, I just don't believe that you're going to fix that with medication long term. Now, that doesn't mean it can't help short term, because it certainly can. But particularly for these young children, there's not one shred of evidence that many of these drugs are appropriate to use with 1- and 2-year-old children, certainly in a policy pharmacy circumstance. And I'm not down on psychotropics because, let me tell you, they can save and change lives when appropriately used. But being a foster child is a social circumstance, not a mental illness. Now, it can trigger depression and some other things that have to be dealt with. But what is the treatment of choice? Is the treatment of choice to begin drug therapy, or is the treatment of choice to begin some type of evidence-based psychological therapy? And I think the former has many more side effects than the latter, and therefore is much more dangerous.
Thank you for your answer. Mr. Renacci, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the panel. You know, one thing great about being in Congress, that I've only been here 3.5 years, is you do get to learn a lot. I was in the business world for 30 years, and I've always believed in the safety net. There's no doubt about that. Coming from Ohio, there's 12,000 Ohio children living in foster care each month. You know, when the state agrees to take on the responsibility of caring for those children and the safety of the vulnerable population, it becomes their responsibility. And too many times, we set them up for failure, not success, which I keep hearing as I'm listening to this panel. And as I started to read about some of the headlines, you know, regarding this issue, out of sight, out of mind, psychotropics in foster care, mind-altering psych drugs for 7-year-olds. These are just media stories that are, as you start to read and figure out what's going on. And you know, when the odds are already really against these individuals, that's very concerning. So what I'm trying to do is get some answers, and I listened. One thing I did hear you say, Dr. McGraw, is throwing additional money onto this problem is not the answer. The current system, I should say. Now, redirecting it might be the answer. But before I let you respond to that, I do want to ask Dr. McGraw and Dr. Naylor, in each of your opinions, really, where is the push for the use of psychotropic drugs coming from? You know, is it the child welfare system? Is it the Medicaid system, drug companies, foster parents, schools, or somewhere else? I'd like to get either of your opinions on that.
Well, I think that the routes into a psychiatrist's office varies. So very often, as a child psychiatrist, I will hear variations of this story. Johnny, who's in foster care, has just lost his 3rd preschool, and his 4th preschool is going to kick him out. He's running around the house, chasing the cat with a knife, and you need to do something, and you need to do something now. And very often, these kids will have had therapy. The problem is that not all therapies are correct. So one of the routes in is because the psychotherapy that's provided is not particularly effective and not evidence-based. But something needs to be done now. And this can come from foster parents. This can come indirectly from schools through the foster parents into the office. Very often it's caseworkers who don't necessarily know how to negotiate a mental health system. And you would think that mental health systems and child welfare systems work together. You would also be very wrong if you thought that. They're very much silos. And so I think very often child welfare workers then will say, okay, I know of this psychiatrist that's treated one of my other, I'll bring this youngster in. I think that also as a child psychiatrist sitting in the office, I look at what is available to make an intervention right now that might be able to head off a psychotropic medication. And one of the biggest problems is access to evidence-based therapies. Like I say, I can get somebody to play Chutes and Ladder with them and talk about nondescript things, but I can't get good evidence-based therapies.
So the push is from all of the above?
Yeah.
Dr. McGraw?
Well, you can tell you're talking to somebody that knows and lives this system, because when he says, I can get somebody to play Chutes and Ladders with him, but if you've got somebody that truly has a serious self-destructive problem, it takes a much higher level of professionalism. And here's the problem. Your caseworkers might have 40 files, and in those, a given file might have 8 kids in it. So you're just talking about being completely overwhelmed. And so what you're doing is you're warehousing the problem short term. You say, I got somebody chasing the cat with a knife and the school won't let him back in. So you want to take them? What are you going to do? And so what they do, that's why I use the term chemical straitjacket. That's exactly what they do. They put the kid in a chemical straitjacket till they can figure something out, but the figuring out part never happens. The
Can you-
figuring out part never happened.
Can you elaborate on your comment earlier about throwing more money at this and just give us here a better solution, or what your solution would be?
What I'm saying is right now, we're overusing psychotropic drugs. That's the model. We're overusing them. And if you throw more money at it, what you're going to do is you're going to spread that problem. That's not the fix. What you've got to do is change the model and then finance the model. You cannot just pour money on the existing model. You've got to change the model and then say, okay, that's all well and good there, Dr. Phil, but how are you going to do that? How are you going to give that caseworker access to the professional level of intervention that they need? Where are you going to get that therapist? How are you going to do that? Where are you going to do it? And that takes manpower, and manpower takes money. And that's what I'm saying. You got to change the model to one that's intervention-based instead of medication-based, and that takes manpower, and manpower takes money.
Time has expired. Mr. Bustani, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. It's a really important hearing. My wife is a CASA in South Louisiana, and I've been hearing about all the horror stories and problems that are sort of built into the system, as all of you have very, very concisely described today. And we were having a conversation not long ago over the kitchen table, and she said, you guys have to do something about this. It's a huge problem. And then when she heard through CASA channels that we were having this hearing, she said, thank God that we're doing this, that we need to look at this problem. And so I want to thank you. I want to thank the panelists for being here. I'm also a medical doctor and have real concerns on a number of issues. One, Dr. Phil, you mentioned the fragmented nature of all this, and my wife has really schooled me on this whole system and how fragmented decision-making is and everything else. And you couple that with these psychotropic drugs, of which, and you correctly said earlier, nobody really knows the mechanism of how they really work, but they do save a lot of lives. But it's even more of a pronounced situation in children, adolescents, and understanding what the long-term impacts will be, especially if the drugs are used inappropriately. I mean, the adolescent and childhood, the neurological systems function a whole lot different, and they respond differently to these drugs. But I want to drill down on something, and that is where is the decision made oftentimes, or for the most part? Is there a pattern? Where are the decisions made to put these children on these drugs? I mean, obviously they see a social worker, a CASA will see them, they may be in the court system. They don't go straight to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist or the family doctor or a general practitioner is the one who has prescribing authority, but somebody's making a decision, sending them to a psychiatrist or a general practitioner, family practitioner, who then writes a prescription. And I'm not convinced in the system that we have today that the person prescribing the medicine is actually following these cases and applying best practices, and appropriate follow-up. So I just love a little more comment on how this decision-making is made at that level to get these kids on these drugs.
So I can begin, and certainly other folks can weigh in. I think the question is a good one, and I think that's why screening and assessment is so critical. When we don't have appropriate screening and assessment tools, we are shooting in the dark, right? And so people are not making informed decisions, no matter who it is that instigates that process. So we need to make sure that that's happening. We're really pleased, actually, that Louisiana is one of our grantees who is focused on installing universal trauma-based screening and assessment in the state for all children in the child welfare system. And they are actually one of our state grantees who came to us and said, we do want to do this grant. We want to be successful. We have installed screening and assessment tools so that we can identify what kids actually need, and many of them don't need psychotropic medications. The problem they found was they didn't have access to the evidence-based interventions that kids do need, and that's the real challenge. And as Dr. Phil says, it costs money to scale up evidence-based interventions. You have to train physicians, you have to train social workers, you have to monitor the program itself to make sure it's being implemented with fidelity. You have to have data systems that can track the outcomes of these kids. That costs money. And so you're right, from the very beginning, we don't have systems in place to actually identify what it is these kids need. So many people are shooting in the dark. And I will say another challenge is that we have to be realistic. A lot of our kids do not have access to providers in a timely way that they need them, right? So some of our kids are waiting for 6 months to see a physician. And so you can imagine that the caseworker knows that that child is not going to see that doctor again, perhaps for another 6 months. And so they are doing the best that they can with the tools that they have available to them. And what we want to do is to expand their toolbox so that they have the right instruments they need to serve individual children where they are.
And is there an appropriate review process in many of the states? After a child's put on psychotropic medication, obviously you need to, track it and monitor it and review the appropriateness of the therapy.
Well, thanks to this, to Congress, led by this committee, and passage of legislation in 2011, we now have a federal mandate that all child welfare systems have a process in place to oversee the psychotropic medication use of children in their care. And what we have heard from researchers, although it's still really early, because now it's only been a few years that these processes have been in place, what researchers are finding, and they're very excited, is that it has made a difference. So your actions have made an impact in the lives of children, and what we want to do is take it to that next step.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. We'll move on to Mr. Crowley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing today, and to Mr. Doggett as well, the ranking member. Dr. Phil, I'm desperate to try to ask you a profound question and hope I might get on your television show, but I can't come up with one. But I do want to thank you for the attention you're bringing to this issue. You mentioned the shadow, the foster youth who were shadows today, and I think the real attempt here is to bring them out of the shadow and into the light, that all of society can better understand the circumstances they're living in. So thank you for that. I had the opportunity, and I also want to thank my good friend and colleague, Karen Bass, who's not a member of the subcommittee, but hope will have an opportunity to say a few words as well. She, since coming to Congress, has been an incredible leader on the issue of foster care. I dabbled a little bit into it, and she's really taken over and really ran with it, so I really appreciate all she's done for this effort. But I had the opportunity this morning to meet with a very impressive young lady named Shanice, who's following me this morning, and we had an opportunity to share some of her experiences and exchange some ideas and thoughts, and to try to find some solutions and actions that can take place to effectively bring about the changes that are needed within the foster care system. And that's what our charge here in Congress is to do, is to try to find ways to bring about change of things that need fixing. And certainly, I think the foster care system is in need of our attention. We've seen the data on how common it is for children in foster care to be prescribed these psychotropic medications, in some cases multiple medications at one time. And in fact, Shanice shared with me her own experiences in terms of being medicated at a very, very young age. In many cases, the medication is trying to solve an issue that perhaps could be better addressed through intervention, as been discussed here earlier today. That's something that, as I mentioned, I talked with Shanice about, but it's also something in my home state of New York where I think new ground is being broken, and I appreciate the work that's taking place there. We need to separate out what's a problem genuinely worthy of medicated treatment and what is better served by social work or other personal engagement. While reducing medications can be a worthy goal in of itself, we want to make sure we are also focusing on a comprehensive approach that includes alternative treatments. New York has been a leader in trying to address the problems of over-medicating foster youth. New York is one of 5 states, including Illinois, as I believe Dr. Naylor, you may be familiar with, participating in a 3-year initiative developed by the Center for Healthcare Strategies and made possible through the Annie E. Casey Foundation. This initiative focuses on collaboration among state agencies to develop more effective practices for the use of these medications in foster care. State experts in New York tell me that this initiative has highlighted important areas that need to be addressed in order to have successful policies on this issue. For example, one of the first challenges they had to meet was how to share data amongst the various agencies. Because while the Office of Children and Family Services was responsible for overseeing the foster care system, the actual medical treatment data was under Medicaid within the Department of Health. And the Office of Mental Health was also involved as well. So even just to survey how widespread the problem is required a new level of interagency cooperation. New York was fortunate that they honed in on this issue early and were able to address it. I know other states may be struggling with similar data sharing problems, so I urge them to look at New York as an example. Beyond just the data sharing aspect, it is critical that multiple agencies work productively together. You have situations where the foster care agency may make recommendations or set protocols, but the doctors prescribing the medication are under the Department of Health. Everyone needs to work together in order to get the best results possible. One of the lessons New York has learned is to emphatically stress collaboration and to ensure that each part of the system understands the impact that reaches beyond a single agency. Ms. Chang, I see that the ACF has sought to encourage this collaboration through their demonstration. So I was wondering if you could possibly expound upon that and comment on what's taking place.
Sure, thank you. We agree with you. We think that collaboration is critical. Children in the foster care system are not served by one agency. They're served by multiple agencies, the Medicaid agencies, the mental health agencies, as well as child welfare. And so that's why we're really excited that this proposal has both a ACF component as well as a CMS component. And that goes to part of what I said about having access to providers. We know that we have to create incentives so that there are physicians who are willing to care for our kids, that we have to create incentives to say that the Medicaid offices can also get funding to pay for the types of supports that they need so that there are providers. And it brings those two major groups that serve these people, these children, to the table to work together.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Crowley. Mr. McDermott, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Full disclosure, I was trained at the University of Illinois and worked at Allendale School, so I know a little bit about the Illinois system. My question is really, let's take Donna. She goes into foster care and somebody writes a script for her to have medication. I'm talking about today, not 3 or 4 years ago when this happened, but today in Illinois. How would that be evaluated before she got the medication? Or would it be a retrospective evaluation 6 months later? Or when did it happen and by whom? And did they ever see her? How would that decision been made for her?
Well, that's a good question, and there are various ways of doing these reviews, prospective and retrospective being the two major categories. Ours is a prospective one, so we review all of the requests before the medication is actually prescribed and dispensed.
So she's creating havoc in the house as a rebellious teenager, which she says she was. Somebody says, this kid needs to be on drugs. So somebody writes a script, and then how long does it take to get to you and your independent agency to make a decision about whether she should have them or not?
I hate to use you as an example, but you're hospitalized right now, and so the medication request comes to DCFS and our program at the very same time, and it has all of the diagnostic information, all of the symptom information, all medications that she would be on, and our review is not a true second opinion. We don't have the resources to be able to send somebody out and do an evaluation. And I think we have like 2,700 kids on medication. That would take a lot of resources to have a second opinion on everybody. And so the work becomes, does the diagnosis and the symptoms match? If they match, is the treatment something that would be a recommended or recognized treatment for that combination of diagnoses and symptoms? If it is the dose requested being an appropriate dosage? And if that's the case, we would approve the medication.
How often do you reject a request for medication for a patient? 1,000 scripts come into you, you look at 1,000 of them. How many times do you say no?
That's a complicated question, and I'll go through it as quickly as I can. I don't deny all that many requests anymore. And the reason I don't deny all that many requests anymore is because I've been doing this now for 15 years. And initially, when I started the program, people would talk to my boss and complain about Dr. Naylor's idiosyncratic psychopharmacology. And so they'd rant and rave against what my recommendations would be. But my boss knew that I was arguing science and arguing good clinical care. And so over time, people have changed their prescribing practices. And so that's one thing we do. Another thing that we do is we ask really embarrassing questions like, do you really think it's a good idea to start this patient who is psychotic on a stimulant, which can cause psychosis? And the very act of asking the question will, again, because I've been there for 15 years, will lead to the doctor withdrawing the request for the medication because they know that if they persist, it will be denied. So we deny probably 1%. There's probably 8% that are rescinded, but this is down from about 15% denials and fairly high rescinding rate about 10 years ago.
And then 6 months later or a year later, you've now put her on the medication, you think it's a good idea. What's the possibility it'll ever be looked at again by someone?
Well, in terms of the consent process, by law, I will look at that again in 6 months. We only provide consent for every 6 months. And we will ask for a clinical update. If at any point along the way, including with the first time that they made a request for the medication, I can request a second opinion from another physician. Or if it's one of those cases that would end up on the front page of the newspaper, I will sometimes go out and do these second opinions. So we will follow up with getting as much clinical information as we can get in order to make a determination whether that medication is still indicated or not.
If she ran into a CASA worker who said, and she said, I don't think I should be on this medication, can I get off it? Can you help me get off it? And they called you, can they call you? Can they appeal to you? Is there any way of appeal to you to review what's going on there?
Absolutely. We actually have several different ways in where requests for a re-review can be made. And these requests can come from guardian ad litems, CASA workers, judges, juvenile judges, caseworkers. The nurses in Illinois are like another pair of eyes and ears, and they will often refer back for additional consultation. And now psychologists are also out in the field doing similar kind of monitoring work. So we will get consultation requests that way. A foster child can go to the guardian ad litem and say, I would like a second opinion on my medication, and we will find a way to get a second opinion done. So yes, there is.
Ms. Chang, is this common across the United States, the Illinois system, as something as comprehensive as that?
This particular model of pre-authorization is not as common as...
Not as common. Give me numbers here.
So I can't give you a 50-state survey. I'm happy to get back to you, sir, and tell you exactly how all states are structuring it. Most states, based on a review, do have a monitoring after the fact. And really, many of those programs are highly successful. Texas is a good example of that. They have protocols for when medication can be used, and they have a systematic way of reviewing all scripts to make sure that they follow the protocol. They also then look at individual physicians who break protocol more than once. And so they have a very effective way of managing medication, even though it doesn't involve pre-authorization. And we find that most states employ that type of having a protocol and then making sure that doctors are following it. There are other models. For example, Massachusetts makes sure that there are mental health professionals who specialize in medication management, who are always available to social workers, caseworkers, as well as other physicians who are seeing these kids, so that whenever questions come up, they can immediately get professional assistance, because oftentimes one of the problems is that these are folks without the expertise in prescribing these types of medications. So they're a variety.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for extending my time.
You're welcome. Thank you, Mr. McDermott. And Ms. Chang, if you could provide that information in writing to the committee, I think that was a very good question. We'd like to have that additional information, please. So I'm just going to repeat a few things that I heard today, and then you can leave. We'll wrap this up. First of all, I heard, I think we're all in agreement, we just don't want to pour money into a system that currently is not operating at 110%, right? So we recognize there's some work there to do. Ms. Chang is working with the states and trying to bring states along to develop systems, and Illinois is a great example of some great progress that has been made, but we all can do better. I think in listening to Ms. Hovener and her suggestions, you know, I really like the idea of no matter what, a second opinion. I think coming from you, that has a lot of power behind it. Choices of therapy. I think Dr. McGraw and Dr. Naylor and others have mentioned that sometimes some therapies just don't work because it's the wrong therapy. So that was a great point that you made, and then the mention of tools, you know, the proper tools for screening, for assessment, and evidence-based, I think is really, really critical. And that's when you begin to apply the resources and the funding, when you know that you've got evidence-based information to make decisions on. I think all of the panel would agree with that, and I think the members that were here today would agree with that. And I want to thank again all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here today. This is such an important topic, and all of the members here that we're here to ask questions and listen to your testimony. And again, a special thank you to Ms. Bass for her work in this arena and helping us schedule this hearing. So if members have additional questions, those of us who are left, for the witnesses, they will submit them to you in writing, and we would appreciate receiving your responses for the record within 2 weeks. The committee now stands adjourned.